Welcome everyone to Plant-Based Kidney Health. As always, I'm Dr. Hashmi. My partner is Michele Crosmer. Thanks so much for joining us. As you guys know, this is part 2 of our lupus discussion. The last part, just if you guys haven't watched it, make sure you get the link. But essentially, we talked about the medical side of lupus, and now we're going to talk about the nutrition side of lupus. So if you want to know what is lupus, how do you diagnose it, how do you treat it, what is all of that stuff, that's going to be part 1. With that, let's dive into part 2. So Michele, let's talk a little bit about lupus and nutrition. Now, when it comes to nutritional recommendations going on for somebody who has lupus nephritis going on, how does that, either is it the same or how does that differ from sort of other kidney diseases that people have?
Yeah, so it can definitely depend. Like, of course, if someone has lupus nephritis and they have kidney damage, kidney disease, we do have to take into account, do they have problems with potassium, sodium intake, even protein, all those things that we typically think about with kidney disease. But the thing, and in kidney disease in and of itself, it's important to remember that there's typically like chronic levels of inflammation. But when we are talking about lupus, and we talked about this in the last episode, is there's typically high levels of inflammation. There's abnormal inflammation. There's flare-ups, relapses. Inflammation and targeting inflammation as much as we can with food and lifestyle is important to then complement whatever treatment and medical plan, your physician is working on with you. So with that, then a big part is thinking, okay, well then what is this anti-inflammatory diet? What are things that cause inflammation? What doesn't cause inflammation? It's if you look things up, you'll find different stuff, but overall, you might find some things that will say like, okay, a Mediterranean type of diet where it's emphasizing fruits and veggies and legumes and whole grains and nuts and seeds and fish over, other meats, especially red meats and processed meats. That can overlap with, then you find a lot of stuff on plant-based diets and, whole food, minimally processed plant-based diets. And again, a lot of it comes down to some of the same things of getting more whole, minimally processed foods in the diet. Fiber is key. So as far as fiber, and we think of gut health, and a lot of inflammation stems from our gut. And if there's gut dysbiosis or our microbiome is off, and we're producing more pathogenic bacteria. And so from that standpoint, and with fiber, what we find is that people who have, the byproduct of fiber fermentation, we have these short chain fatty acids. And when people have low levels of short chain fatty acids, then they, then that is linked with more inflammation. So part of that is fiber. A lot of foods that are higher in fiber, those whole plant foods, especially fruits and veggies, are also going to be potent antioxidants as well. So I think in general, just kind of summing up, we want to be getting in those whole plant-based foods more in the diet, and then really trying to limit and cut back on those more pro-inflammatory foods, especially the red and processed meats. But again, just highly processed food in general, junk food, fast food, deeply fried food, tons of added sugar in food, all of those things that can be more pro-inflammatory. Another thing with lupus and with lupus nephritis is people have, and even studies have shown that people who are obese or very overweight with lupus, then they have higher risk of different, metabolic diseases and insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes, and then cardiovascular disease. And so that is something that's important to keep in mind as well, as we want this diet and lifestyle to support and maintain a healthy weight so that people aren't at higher risk. I mean, they're already at higher risk, but not amplifying that higher risk of cardiovascular disease. Or potentially if there's, medication side effects of gaining weight or higher blood sugar, like all of those things come into play. And then you mentioned in the last episode about vitamin D. And so that is something too, again, whether someone has just having lupus, people with kidney disease have are more likely to be vitamin D deficient. And then you talked about people with lupus needing to supplement vitamin D. And so I think that's important to make sure that your vitamin D levels are being checked, that vitamin D deficiency or insufficiency is being treated. And that's something that's even more important than with lupus and lupus nephritis. Another thing that oftentimes comes up too for diet and as far as inflammation, a lot of times you'll hear about like omega-3 fatty acids. And, what it is a little bit more, it's like that ratio of your omega-3 fatty acid intake to your omega-6 and omega-9 fatty acid intake. So the omega-3s, the olive oil, even the fish oil, the certain, parts of nuts and seeds and stuff, though we want a higher intake of that and a lower intake of the omega-6. And the omega-6 we see more in those like sunflower oil, soybean oil, safflower oil, which are usually more in processed foods in general. And so that's where the standard American diet or this westernized diet, which is highly processed, typically has more inflammatory oils and it has less of those omega-3 fatty acids, which are more anti-inflammatory. So a lot of times in different, if you're Googling nutrition for lupus nephritis, anything like that, omega-3s are typically part of that, as well as then a diet that is abundant in especially fruits and vegetables. That's key. You mentioned last time too, more alkaline diet. Those fruits and veggies are like the number 1 and 2 foods that are helping to lower the potential renal acid load, helping with proteinuria, helping with inflammation. And so I'd say those are probably the main things. And then the quality and the quantity of protein does come into play. So of course, if someone has just lupus in general, typically it's recommended, moderate protein intake, avoiding very high protein intake. But then if someone does already have kidney damage, depending on their stage, then it might be, okay, we want to go a little bit lower. And of course, then the plant-based proteins over the animal-based proteins, or at least having them more often, can also be beneficial.
Excellent. So
that was a lot. So any questions on that?
Well, let me ask you, Michele. So, in lupus nephritis, we talked about in the last episode that there are certain people who are at much higher risk for getting flare-ups. And those are, of course, if you're younger, when you start having lupus in the first place, if you're somebody who's male gender, if you're African-American, if you're Hispanic going on, if your proteinuria is greater than 4 grams going on, these are all things that put you at a higher risk. Now, in those flare-ups, can you talk a little bit about what are the things that you want to make sure that your diet includes so that, we have our baseline diet. And as we get into flare-ups and people, the tendency for people is not to become stricter on their diet in flare-ups. It's actually to go the opposite way. So what's important in flare-ups?
So I think, well, first of all, flare-ups and not in flare-ups, I think one of the most important things is remembering that your diet is helping your treatment plan, right? Like it's not this one or the other. And so you can't just do the medication. And oftentimes, for many people, you can't just do the diet. But I think the important thing with that is looking at just your lifestyle as a whole. And that's where sometimes a lot of those other things, which again, you mentioned in the last episode, come into play. A lot of times we just focus on what we eat, but we're not realizing that we are extremely stressed. We're not sleeping well. We're not happy. We don't have good relationships at home, all these other things that are causing more stress on the body. And then that in turn can make a flare up worse or potentially trigger a flare up, these environmental factors. So I would say to focus on, of course, the diet side of it and everything that we just mentioned. But the other side of it is, okay, what are your stress levels and what are you doing to help with that? Because just like there's things we can do. And we mentioned like exercise is so important, especially for those, kind of chronic levels of stress. But then when there's acute levels of stress or a flare up, that's where it's even more important to make sure that you have some of those stress management techniques. So is it meditation? Are there breathing exercises? Can you get more sleep? Can you get help with other things in your daily life to help lower those levels of stress? And then the sleep side of it's important. What is your bedtime routine like? Are you watching TV or on your phone or having screen time up until the minute you fall asleep? And so you're not sleeping as well. And then the physical movement, physical exercise part of it is extremely important. And again, it's important for all levels of it, but especially I think a lot of times when there is a flare up, that's even more important to make sure you're including those lifestyle factors on top of everything diet wise.
Excellent. Excellent. Now, I cringe almost to ask this question, but this is a question we get asked a lot, which is what about a raw diet when it comes to lupus nephritis?
Yeah. So, and I get asked that. And I think, and the other thing too, I think usually with like raw diet, people are talking like a raw vegan or raw plant-based diet. But so of course, I mean, again, raw is that there's usually no or minimal heat, used. So people are consuming, raw fruits and veggies, raw nuts and seeds. And then from the standpoint of like grains and legumes, typically they'd be consuming like sprouted grains or legumes. And then, maybe using like dehydration techniques, which are a lot lower temperature, things like that would be allowed on a raw diet. The thing is that there's not research on a raw plant-based, raw vegan diet for lupus nephritis, and kidney disease. And so to say like, okay, this is going to be something that everyone should be doing, I mean, we can't say that. I think where a lot of times people will find information on that or providers recommending that, it's anecdotal. Maybe they worked with their, patients have tried it themselves or providers have worked with their clients and that. But I think the most important thing is if you look at what people are eating is they're eating whole minimally processed plant foods. And it's hard to have more of that processed junk like vegan junk food or plant-based junk food when you're on this raw type of diet because it's not allowed because it's been heated or cooked or processed in some sort of way. And so the claim to it is that it reduces inflammation faster. And that's what, people claim with that. But what I've found from looking into it is it's not usually this sustainable long-term plan. Like people will maybe be on this short term, like, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks type of protocol of doing this raw type of diet. And then to supposedly more quickly reduce inflammation. And then they're going to transition and getting more, cooked foods in because that's more sustainable. So I think from that standpoint, again, just it's not scientifically proven or studied that is going to be beneficial. I think that if someone's interested in doing something like that, or they want, to go more raw type and do less cooked, I mean, work with the renal dietitian or your physician, get some feedback on it because you want to make sure that you are still getting all the micronutrients that you need, and not, lacking anything in the diet because it's a more restrictive diet.
I agree. And from a medical perspective, the only thing that I would say is you are immunosuppressed. So please, 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 if you're going to do that, wash all your foods really, really well. Yep. If you get a small infection, that small infection is going to be a very big deal because we are purposely trying to shut down your immune system in things like lupus nephritis. So it's a really big deal. The dangers of lupus nephritis is if you don't treat it, you're looking at dialysis. And if you do treat it, we're shutting down your immune system where the smallest infection, a common cold or anything else, becomes a really big deal because your body can't fight against it. And the last part of all of that stuff is you don't want to turn diet into religion. You don't want to make it so sort of exclusive that it becomes such another stress. And the key thing that we talk about is how do you minimize your stress? And by minimizing stress is how are you happier? How are you expressing gratitude? How are you able to enjoy things? How are you able to enjoy the company of people around you? So food is so important part of that if you make it so exclusive and so many barriers that it really becomes difficult on that part. So Michele, when it comes to things like lupus nephritis, let me ask you, if you had to give us like your top tips, tricks in terms of, one thing to eat versus what are some things definitely not to eat? What would you say in terms of specific foods?
Well, I'd say before I get into specific foods, I'd say the first thing I would say is focus on quality of your diet and your lifestyle really as a whole, because a lot of times we get hooked on these labels of raw, vegan, plant-based, all these different labels. And like, this has to be a lifestyle thing. Like you said, that people are going to be living with lupus, potentially lupus nephritis and kidney disease. And so these have to be sustainable lifestyle changes. So I think just in general, number one tip is like focus on the quality of it and not having a label on your diet, and focus on the labels on the food that you're eating and like what's in them. Like that would be the number one tip. I think as far as the things to, first kind of we've talked about the tier of like things that we want to be cutting out. And again, I think processed meats, especially, yes, highly processed food in general, but definitely processed meats and red meats. Those are a great place to start of getting those out. And then you work your way down of substituting more of those whole plant-based foods for those. And number one and two things to include in the diet, because it's just as important, if not more important, of what you are adding to your diet versus what you're taking away, is going to be the fruits and vegetables. People do not, whether they have kidney disease or not, lupus or not, people do not eat enough fruits and vegetables. And so I think that's a good place to start, in getting to where, if you cut out ice cream and you substitute it with oat milk ice cream, you're still getting more inflammatory oils and sugar in that. It's not the same as if you allow your taste buds to change and start to really enjoy fresh fruit as, a sweet treat. And so I think it's just focusing on how can you slowly start to do that. I mean, people can do it quickly too if they want to make fast changes, but again, sustainability is important. So I'd say best things to add in is start, how do we get fruits and veggies in? How in general, because we're talking about quality of diet, do we get, it comes down to preparing more meals at home, relying less on fast food and eating out, and, package things that makes things easy. And it's, cook some food in bulk, like, chop up your veggies twice a week and store them in containers in the fridge. And that way you can quickly add it to your meal, utilize frozen veggies. But all these things are things that I think I probably sound like a broken record and continuously talk about, but they make a huge difference, because again, the quality of the food that you have is going to be better, and you have more control in your diet if you are cooking it as opposed to someone else cooking it, or someone making it easy and in this package, and all you have to do is zap it in the microwave. So I'd say those are probably the main things. And then just another tip to remember in general is that diversity of the diet really is important. It's important for our gut health. It's important for reducing inflammation, which is our overall goal with lupus and with lupus nephritis. And also for this to be a sustainable plan, is there has to be diversity. If you're eating the same exact thing, breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day, I think people start off as saying, and I've heard this, I'm a creature of habit, I could eat the same thing every day. Eventually people are going to get sick of it. And we want there to be diversity, because it's good for our gut health. It's good for our heart health, our kidney health. It's good for lowering inflammation to have different, our cruciferous veggies, our cauliflower and our, kale and arugula and our broccoli have benefits, just like our leafy greens, just like our bell peppers and our carrots, and just like our aromatics of our onions and garlic and shallots. And all of those are important. And so the diversity is really key there for inflammation, gut health, kidney health, heart health, diabetes. Pretty much everything.
All right. Well, I think that kind of does it for this version of part 2 of our lupus series going on. Guys, if you have enjoyed this, we'd be so grateful if you can share this, like it, subscribe it. If you're on Apple Podcasts, please leave us a review going on. And we really want to know, what topics do you guys want to know? We're always trying to tailor these talks so that you guys get the most out of it. So if there's topics, if there are different ways of doing this, we're also going to be bringing on some guests. So if there are folks that you really want to make sure that we interview on this show, please let us know. Send us an email on them. We would love to connect with them and bring them on and really be able to help you grow in your journey. And at the end of the day, it's all about progress over perfection. So with that, thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.